Welcome to today's webinar. We're happy to present to our friends at the Florida chapter. Today's webinar is a lot to do with what we measure in clubs, what kind of data we're looking at, and why. And we'll do some live demonstrations as well towards the end of the webinar. But what we've observed, I should introduce myself. This is Ray Cronin from Club Benchmarking. I'm the founder of the company. And the whole catalyst for this webinar, this project that we've undertaken, has a lot to do with the work we've done with nearly 450 club boards around the country in terms of finance and in terms of governance and how those two are related. And maybe I'd say not just finance, but operations as well. So the purpose of today's webinar is to really scratch the surface on business intelligence, KPIs, key performance indicators, and what clubs are measuring and discussing in the boardroom. For some background in context, which is so critical, and frankly, I think is so often missing in the boardroom. Let's just take a step back. One of the things that we've observed in our travels is it tends to be, and it's a significant proportion, let's say 90% of the boards in this country really veer towards being an operating board and dealing with tactical issues, as opposed to being a strategic board in governing not for last month's budget, but governing for the future of the club. And I would suggest respectfully that a lot of that has to do with what data we even begin to look at. The data that we put on the table at this point in too many board meetings is inviting boards to be operationally oriented and tactical in short term as opposed to long term and strategic. There's a few other issues that revolve around that. I'm not going to get into those so much today. I'm going to touch upon one in detail. But let's just say this, a really, really critical approach to succeeding as a club is the clubs that have a very clear vision of where they're going, and they're driving forward with passion, they're driving forward with intent to that vision. They have a constant forward momentum. I mean, I think actually many of the clubs in Florida, if you take let's say the Boca Palm Beach area, and you take the Naples, Sarasota, Tampa area up the West Coast, some of the residential community clubs have demonstrated this over the last 8 years, 10 years. They've really, as we all know, there's a number of those clubs that have invested significantly, and they're investing in their future, and they see the benefits of it because these clubs are enjoying rising initiation fees. They're residential community clubs. They're enjoying demand for the real estate in their club. The clubs that are investing and have invested, without question, enjoy the benefit of that, which is more interest and more relevant. So this concept of governing forward and thinking strategically and having a very clear vision of where we're going and why, and then driving forward to that vision with constant momentum. That's the key to success in clubs. It's never going to happen that 100% of the members in a given club are going to be on board with that vision or with that intentful movement forward, which always requires money. But that's okay. Not all the members have to be on board. If 70 or 80% are on board, that's enough, and that's what we do. And, maybe I'd use the term naysayers. Well, the naysayers have a choice. They can leave the club or they can get on board and go forward. But, more often than not, whatever the project is, whether it's fitness or casual dining or a resort-style pool, the first people to show up, as we all know, are the ones that were the most negative on the project. So today's webinar really is about what are the key metrics, what are the key performance indicators that allow clubs to kind of focus on the future and focus on the strategic picture. As a precursor to that, I've recently been really studying as opposed to reading a book. And the book is a compilation of all the great articles and white papers that have been written in the Harvard Business Review in the last 20 years on business strategy. It's a fascinating book. If you wanted to pick it up, it's a Harvard Business Review book. The title is On Strategy. And in the very first paragraph, which is in a white paper written by Michael Porter, who's one of the grandfathers of really consistent business strategy and business planning over time. In the first paragraph, there's these 3 points that are made. Organizations must be flexible and respond rapidly to competitive and market changes. Organizations must benchmark continuously to achieve best practices. That's the very purpose of club benchmarking and what we do every day. And organizations must nurture a few core competencies to stay ahead of rivals. And I think the point there is we have to know what we're trying to be and be really, really good at it and make sure that in some way it allows us to differentiate ourselves. But the one that really hits me is that, you know, the title of that paragraph or that section of the white paper is Operational Effectiveness is Not Strategy. And boy, when I read that, it hit me over the head like a ton of bricks in relation to clubs and the way we work as clubs. Because back to the point, 90% of the boards in this country, in my opinion, I can't prove it, but I've seen it in the work I've done with boards, believe that operational effectiveness is the key to success. No, operational effectiveness is up to the staff, and it's kind of like the ante to get into the poker game. But it sure as heck isn't strategy. Strategy in clubs goes directly back to the point I made earlier. It's all about the vision. Where is this club going to be in 5 years? In doing that every 5 years, constantly driving forward, never becoming complacent, never thinking what we have is good enough. It just doesn't work that way because the market is constantly changing. What is relevant, what turns Generation X is on is very different than baby boomers. So that constantly changing market, the constantly evolving demographics make it necessary in matter of life or death for clubs to think forward, to drive forward to a clear vision. And that's what strategy is. Strategy is the way you get to achieve your vision. It's the methods and the means that you'll employ to achieve that vision. And that's great governance, is when boards are thinking about that issue as opposed to how many covers we had last week or last month, whether the hamburger was too cold or too hot yesterday for my buddy. That's the way clubs are going to thrive and succeed over time. Just to maybe pound on that a little bit, you know, the operational board, which we are all familiar with, you might characterize the discussion as a backward-looking discussion. It's all about in the boardroom meeting monthly. How did we do against budget last month? What was the big issue last weekend or last month? Were the greens too slow in the member? The agenda in the operational board meeting isn't tied to a forward-looking strategic plan. We think the strategic board, if it comes to financial discussion, and it comes to the income statement of the operating budget, the basic question is, are we on track to meet the operating budget for the year? 90% of the clubs in the country set the operating budget to break even, excluding depreciation. So effectively what that question is are we on track to break even this year operationally? And if the answer from the CFO, controller, or general manager is yes, we are, that's it. We're done with the operating budget, because there's so much more to talk about that's so much more important that we want to move on to the forward-looking strategic plan. So Jim Butler, my partner at Club Benchmarking, and Kurt Keebler, who everyone knows, have done some collaboration and thought through at a high level, like if you were to say, what's the ideal board agenda? This is their view of that based on their experience. And it's a significant amount of experience. But, you know, the key to it is that ideal board agenda is to try to not get stuck on operating issues and operating measures, but to really make the heart of the board meeting a discussion around our strategic plan, where we're at in relation to the plan, where we're at in relation to our future vision. That's the core topic of the meeting every month. It's forward-looking, it's strategy, not operations, just as Michael Porter says, and it's all about the vision. Also, two pieces that become critical if we are to orient that way. One is education. It's critical that boards be educated on the club market. I like to say that we could have the perfect governance manual. We could have the perfect board policy manual. We could have all of the perfect processes and procedures in relation to governance. But if the board doesn't understand the business and understand what drives success in this industry, not in the industry they came from, but in this industry, if they don't understand this industry, all of the great governance processes in the world aren't going to help us. We have to treat governance as a vehicle for truly understanding what drives success in the club industry. And I know this, I'm flying to clubs every week, and I'm going to be dead long before we ever achieve that objective. But we won't give up trying. We're running around educating, trying to educate, not using opinion, but data, as to what truly drives success from a financial perspective in clubs. And I'm going to show you in a minute. I really, really, really believe we've cracked that code, and it's very clear. And whenever I do present it to a board, they get it completely. But the key is education, and that education helps ferment innovation. You know, think of it, any market in 2020, in this day and age, any market, any company that isn't innovating, that isn't truly innovating, that isn't really trying to figure out how to create the future, how to differentiate itself, any company, any club that isn't innovating, it's not long in the future where they're going to be left behind. Innovation inside this market is absolutely critical. We have so much more we can do in terms of innovation. Now, if you look at Florida specifically, back to the point I made earlier, if you think about all of the literally billions of dollars that have been invested in the last decade in Florida, which have all been, and for many of these clubs, have been done so well and so wisely, but resort style pools, real nice, informal, kind of higher end casual dining venues in the club, multiple dining venues in the club, the whole fitness and wellness revolution, the whole spa and salon revolution. Those things were innovative. Those things were game changing, but they've been done now. Those no longer provide differentiation. Like any market, the market's going to keep evolving. Those are just ante now. If you don't have those things, you're probably going backwards. So the question now then becomes, from an innovation perspective, what comes next? That's a whole nother topic, but that's just an example of how continuous innovation is required. And there's all sorts of ideas on what might come next. So the key is, in terms of the board agenda, you know, at a high level, we need to make sure the agenda, and in today's webinar, we're going to tie KPIs to this, that the agenda fosters a forward-looking, strategic, and market-based view of the future, as opposed to, how many covers did we do last month? How fast were the greens? I'm trying to, like heck, to draw out the distinction between what's so important, which is so tactical. And that's this world we're living in the boardroom of clubs. So the agenda really needs to mute an operational focus and drive a strategic focus, and that goes right back to the metrics that we provide to the board and or the committees as well. So I had said, in terms of trying to, I said we cracked the code, and I think we've cracked the code from a financial perspective on what really drives financial success over time in clubs. In this slide is the cracking of the code. It took us 7 years of hard work to really understand this and discover it. But it's so, so important. I'm going to take about 5 minutes and try like heck to communicate what it shows us. So first off, at club benchmarking, we don't use averages. Averages blur variation. The whole point of benchmarking is to illuminate variation and then understand what drives that variation. And when we look at variation, as we do with this chart, some clubs don't fare so well, and some clubs fare fabulously well. And the whole exercise of benchmarking is to use the data to discern what the practices are of the clubs that do fabulously well versus the practices of the clubs that do not so well. And that's what feeds the concept of best practices. So on these two charts, the variation that we're showing with the curves, the blue line is the operating result. So it's the operating bottom line on the income statement. And as I said earlier, 90% of the clubs in the country set the operating bottom line to break even, excluding depreciation. Depreciation, as we all know, is considered a capital expense and shows up on the capital ledger. So this blue line shows the distribution for the last fiscal year of the operating results for the clubs in our database. In the median, which is the point at which half the clubs fall below and half fall above, as you can see, it says 1%. So what that means is that club in the middle had an operating result that was 1%. That's the margin, 1% of the operating revenue, which in using words instead of numbers, that's a break-even outcome, just as would be expected because the club set that to occur. So the operating budget is set to break even. This chart proves that clubs break even. At club benchmarking, we say if a club is hovering between -4 and +4% on operating margin, that's essentially break even. Obviously, we set the operating ledger to break even, but you're not going to hit it exactly. There's going to be some, little extra or a little less than we planned, but it's still a break-even outcome. So we say -4 to +4% represents a break-even outcome. And when you look at the distribution here, you go to the left, -4, and you go all the way to the right, -4, it's about 70% of the clubs. So that's the proof that clubs do break even operationally. And so this is the key point. If it's a break-even operating outcome, by definition, that's not a financial driver. The operating ledger is not the financial driver in a club. The operating ledger is the vehicle for delivering services and amenities to members. It's literally consumed every year by members enjoying the club. It doesn't produce a financial outcome. Yet in the boardroom and the finance committee room, we scrutinize the living heck out of the operating ledger, thinking that that's the key to financial success. It's not. We have to view the operating ledger as it is, and as it should be, as the vehicle for delivering services and amenities to members. When we're scrutinizing it and we're trying to cut costs, all that's going to happen is we're muting the dues increase or we're keeping the dues down. But we're not going to generate more financial outcome off of it. We're just going to break even because that's the way we set the budget. But if we're cutting those expenses, then obviously we're impacting the value proposition. So that one point is critical. Now, if you look at the gold line here, all we've done is we've put capital income into the same context as the operating result. So the gold line shows the total capital income as a percentage of operating revenue as well. So this club in the median, that 1% that had the 1% operating margin, had capital income equal to 13% of its operating revenue. That's the pile of free cash. That's the money that the club has to do something with. Capital income is the financial driver of a club. That's what provides financial sustainability over time. So capital income is the financial driver, and if the board or the finance committee wants to figure out where financial success lies, or they want to scrutinize the financial outcome, they need to look to the capital ledger, not the operating ledger. The operating ledger is the value proposition. The capital ledger is the financial driver. And capital income, and there follows capital investment. That's what drives a club forward financially over time. It took us 7 years of hard work to figure that out, to discover this. And I can't tell you how important it is. I can't tell you how it's changed my own personal perspective of this industry. And I can't overemphasize how critical it is that boards and finance committee members ascertain this knowledge the instant they become a member of the board or the committee. Because if we're scrutinizing the operating ledger for financial outcomes, we're messing around with the value proposition, and we're not providing a financial future for the club. And by the way, I think Terry may have sent a note out, but if anyone has any questions during the webinar, please feel free to ask them in real time. I'd much rather answer them as this moves forward than wait till the end. So I hope everyone, this resonates with everyone. I hope everyone can embrace this concept, because this is a critical concept. So as such, what we need to look at when we look at key performance indicators are back to the theme of the webinar, measuring what matters and tying the measurement to strategic outcomes. When we look at the key performance indicators, the way we look at it, there's two approaches. There's a certain set of metrics that need to be understood, but they change over the course of a year. There can be variation in these metrics month to month, but the month to month variations aren't strategic, they're tactical. The strategic variation in these measures occurs annually, because clubs set a budget annually, and it's an annual rhythm, it's an annual outcome. You may have, in some clubs, if it rains like it's been raining in Florida, and I'm going to show you some data in a minute that might indicate that it's clear it's been raining more than normal. But there might be variations that occur as a result of, as an example, weather, and they may cause a monthly variation, and they may even cause a monthly deviation to budget. But that's not important in that month. What matters is at the end of the year, is it going to kind of wash itself out, which I can prove. I just showed the data. We can prove with data that at the end of the year, these month-to-month variations do wash out with clubs, and that clubs end up breaking even at the end of the year. So it's a tactical, the operating ledger is tactical, it's not strategic, but we need to make sure when we measure the KPIs on the operating ledger, as we do here, that they're really approaching that ledger from as high a level or a strategic level as can be. And so we've listed the metrics that we track, and we think of the KPIs on the operating ledger. On the capital ledger, every one of these metrics is truly strategic. Basically, I could take 3 of these metrics and do it all the time. I could pick 3 out of the 10. What I pick is net worth over time, net PP&E to gross PP&E ratio, and the net available capital to revenue ratio. I could take those three metrics and look at them for a club and then predict what I would see going to a club or going through the front door of a club. You can predict whether there's going to be holes in the carpet or whether the carpet's going to be fresh. You can predict whether the parking lot's going to be nice and updated or whether it's going to have potholes and cracks. You could predict whether it looks like a resort-style pool or an old bathtub. And the predictions, by the way, are right on. It's just these metrics show what a club has done financially over a long period of time. These are strategic metrics. These are the metrics we need to put in front of the board without question. These are the metrics board, finance committee members, and the member owners of a club must embrace for their own club, because these are the metrics that reflect how well or how poorly governance has occurred at the club over a longer period of time, let's say a decade or more. These metrics manifest or vary over a long period of time. There are measures that we believe should be viewed monthly in the boardroom, but ironically, they're not the tactical measures. These are the most strategic measures. So the long-term variation in clubs, ultimately, in how a club is faring on long-term key performance indicators, ultimately that is the report card that shows, back to Michael Porter's point, how well a club has responded to a constantly changing marketplace. The clubs that have not responded well to a constantly changing marketplace have net worth that is declining over time. And the clubs that have done well at responding have net worth that's increasing over time. So, but the key point is, how do we know what's going on in the marketplace? And this is something that's taken us, we've been working on this for about 3 years now, over 3 years. And what we've realized is the insight that we have as clubs into our market is very opaque. And we're trying to make it clear. We're trying to make the market and what's going on in the market come alive in the boardroom so that the board can understand its market. You know, back to the point of key great governance. It's so important the board understands the market clearly. I've been on the boards of for-profit companies. In a boardroom, in a for-profit company, one can't overemphasize how much the discussion revolves around what's going on in the market, what's going on with our competitors. Is the market growing or contracting? Is the pricing in the market going up or going down? How is our market share? Is our market share increasing or declining? How is our competitive posture? What's the innovation that's occurring in the market? Are there any shifts or any innovative changes that are coming out of left field that could hurt us as a competitor in the market? Are we changing in concert with the changes that the customers demand? That market-based discussion is central to boardroom discussion in for-profit companies, because that's the strategic issue. So I just mentioned a whole bunch of attributes of the market. How often are we talking about those in the boardrooms of our clubs? I would suggest, with great respect and empathy, because I've been on my own club's board and I've been in front of 450 others, that discussion is vacant at the moment for the most part. We, as GMs, controllers, staff members, are responsible for bringing that market context, that market texture into the boardroom and trying to lift the discussion of the board to address it. I suggest that the reason that boards are operating oriented and tactically oriented is because we as an industry have not had the grasp of what's going on in the market to put in front of the board. And nature abhors a vacuum. If the strategic issues aren't on the table, then the time will still be used for discussion. It's going to devolve to operational if in the absence of the strategic issues. So what we've done now is we've created for the industry, and we have 40 clubs in Florida. I think it's about 40 clubs, might be 30. It's 30 or 40 already participating. We're going to show you the Florida data in a minute here. We have about 60 Florida clubs on this webinar. So if we could get all the clubs in this webinar to participate, my guess is we'd have over 60 clubs in Florida participating now. And it will give you a strategic view into what's going on in the Florida club market, and it can't be anything more important than that. So it's ironic, but the most strategic things change in the club industry on a monthly basis, and that's what's going on in the market. Are members entering clubs or leaving clubs? Is the member count growing or shrinking? Is the cost of belonging going up or down? And if it's going up, at what rate is it increasing? Initiation fees going up or down? We can also characterize with a very few financial metrics. We have 6, as you see here. We can characterize how clubs themselves are doing. Are clubs growing or shrinking? Is the dues line growing or shrinking? Is the non-dues revenue growing or shrinking? Non-dues revenue, without question, would correlate to, let's say, weather, as I said earlier. More rain, less non-dues revenue, because less golf, less food and beverage, etc. So we can gather from a club, and we've got over 150 clubs now participating nationally in this, and we can gather within 20 minutes for every club. Within 20 minutes, we can gather the data that will allow clubs to clearly determine what's going on in their market, and we can make it as local as you'd like it to be, as long as your fellow peer clubs will participate. So these are the metrics we gather. These metrics are critical. I want to show an example of what operating KPIs are. Before we started this work on the strategic monthly dashboard, we looked at over 60, at the board reports from over 60 clubs, and the data that was being put in front of the board in over 60 clubs. And if I were to characterize it, I'd characterize it as such. It veered heavily towards operational data, and it lacked strategic data, and it without question lacked market insight, because the market insight didn't exist until we started this. But these are the kind of metrics that might be important for a committee, or without question, they're important for a department head. And at some point, they may become important for a board, but they're not important for a board every month. If cover counts went down every month for 12 months in a row, there might be something going on with the quality and service and food and beverage that would begin to rise to the level of the board. But if cover counts are bouncing around this month, the next month, and they're around where they've always been, or they're growing slightly, it's not a strategic issue. The F&B manager needs to know it inside and out, upside and down, but the board doesn't need to know it. So what we have to do is we have to make sure that when we're putting key performance indicators or business intelligence or dashboards on the table, that we put them on the table in consideration of the audience who's viewing it. A board member, as the audience, has a very different set of responsibilities and a different set of metrics they should be measuring than the food and beverage manager. And that's a critical point we have to embrace as the club industry begins to embrace business intelligence to help make better decisions. We don't want to invite an operational focus and micromanagement into the boardroom based on the data we provide to the board. If cover counts is on the report, we're going to get asked about cover counts, but that takes away from time discussing what's going on in the market. So we've developed an approach that measures are targeted at different stakeholders, and that we need to have strategic KPIs in front of the board, in front of the finance committee, in front of the committees. the KPIs that the board sees should be meaningful towards a strategic outcome or objective. And it's all going to tie into the club's business and strategic plan. One of the things that's driving us, frankly, is I was on the board of my club and very involved in my club when the last economic meltdown occurred in 2007 and 8. And I remember, as do I'm sure many of us on this webinar, the stress that occurred in that period of time, because the club industry got hit hard. Most clubs had more members leaving than entering. Obviously, initiation fees for many, many clubs were cut, or they went down dramatically, or they went to zero. And I think some of those decisions, if not all of them, were made poorly because they were made in the absence of the market. If everyone in the market is tanking, cutting the initiation fee isn't going to change the outcome for anyone if the market itself is the problem. So we have to understand the market. We have to understand it accurately in order to make the right decisions in the boardroom. In this motivation, part of the motivation for what we're doing is to get our industry ready for the next meltdown or the next recession, because there's one coming, and clubs will feel it. I suggest clubs will feel it even more than the general economy, because clubs already are in a bit of a jam. A quarter of the clubs in this country are doing fabulously well. A quarter of the clubs in this country are in severe financial distress, and half the clubs in the country are going sideways. So for 75% of the clubs in the country, they're either going sideways or feeling severe financial distress. That next recession is going to be pretty tough. But we need to understand in the marketplace, are we doing better or worse than the market? Because that'll help us make better decisions. I've put this slide into the webinar today just to just put it back on the table. It's something that we always mention. If you're discussing food and beverage profit or loss in your boardroom, we're way off track. We have to get that out of the boardroom. We have to get the board to understand that food and beverage is an amenity. It's not a profit center. It's no different than golf. And we have to get the board to understand that the healthiest clubs in the country financially are the clubs that subsidize F&B the most, using this data, Group A clubs, and the weakest clubs financially in the industry. In fact, most of the clubs that are in severe financial distress is the quarter of the industry that makes a profit in food and beverage, and that's the Group C clubs on this chart. So we just want to make sure that that issue is front and center in the minds of the folks on this webinar, and as it relates to the board discussion in your club. Okay, so let's talk now about I think I might have a question. Terry, do we have any questions? I just saw something pop up there. I'm going to take a minute and see if there are any questions at this point, and then I'll answer them, and then we'll look at the strategic monthly dashboard.
Just a hello, Ray.
Okay.
No questions thus far. Someone did ask earlier if the slide deck was going to be available. I am recording, and we will also distribute a PDF of the slide deck.
Okay. Thank you. And by the way, just again, if you do have questions, please ask. So here's what we call a strategic monthly dashboard. You know, first off, why monthly? Well, there's definitely a growing interest in this industry in business intelligence. And for the most part, boards meet monthly. I know in some of the residential community clubs in Florida, we might take a month or two off in the summer. But for the most part, the industry is in a monthly rhythm. So boards are meeting monthly. And clearly, we want to discuss key performance indicators in relation to that monthly meeting rhythm. But we don't want to put operating metrics into that discussion, because that's going to invite operational focus. So what should we put into that monthly rhythm measurement? We believe, with a lot of development and innovation that we've done, we've got over 150 clubs now involved, that consistent information over time. It shouldn't change when you have one board versus another board, or one president versus another president or treasurer. The mission critical KPIs don't change because we have a new president or a new treasurer. But we do that in the club industry because they say, hey, I want to measure this or I want to measure that. Well, that's as a lack of result or a lack of insight or understanding the industry. The thing that we need to understand every month in the boardroom is what's going on in the market. That's constantly changing. While the cost of belonging may not change for a given club every month, it changes once a year. The cost of belonging is changing every single month in the club market because clubs change their dues every single month in the club market. We track when a club closes its fiscal year, and I can prove with data that clubs close their fiscal year every month of the year. Some club is closing their fiscal year. Now, there's more common months than others. December is the most common year end, and September is the second most common year end. But in Florida, there's a fair number of clubs that have a June year end. So the point is, clubs are closing their fiscal year and starting a new one every month of every year, and therefore they're changing their cost of belonging, their dues, their initiation fees, everything else is changing every month of every year. So we think that the strategic measures that we want to look at monthly are market-based. And we think that that market view provides mission-critical insight over time. And we think that clubs need to accurately be able to assess what's going on in their market, not in an ad hoc way, but in a consistent, systematic way over time. Not because I send my buddy, who's the manager of the club next door, an email and say, how many members you take in last month, but because systematically I can show every month how many members our club is taking in versus our local peers. And we do that every month. We shouldn't be doing it on an ad hoc basis. So that's the goal. These are the goals of the strategic monthly dashboard: to provide that mission critical insight over time, to provide critical and accurate market data to every club, to foster a strategic focus in the boardroom and the senior staff meeting room, to provide insight into how our club is faring, as Michael Porter said, in the constantly changing competitive market, and to allow the staff, the boards and committees to therefore make better decisions. I really, really believe all of the clubs, I would say to a club, all of the clubs that cut or eliminated their initiation fee in the last market meltdown made a mistake. I think I can prove that. It doesn't, I can prove with data, the lower the initiation fee, the less the members the club has. So it doesn't give you more members, it just gives you more churn. But the point is, those decisions were made because there wasn't market insight. So we're trying to help clubs separate these strategic KPIs and get them into the monthly rhythm of the board meeting. I'm not going to get into this slide too much because we're going to actually show you what's going on in the Florida market here. But we've selected KPIs that meet specific goals. Probably one of the important ones that for the folks on the webinar is every club of the over 150 that now are providing data for this market insight have told us they can give us the data in less than 20 minutes a month. So it's not, there's no cost. We're doing it for free for the market. So the only cost for a club is the 20 minutes a month of time investment. You already have all this data at your fingertips. It's just transmitting it into the market database. And so it's very little effort for very significant gain. So here's the metrics are again, and I'm going to show you now. I have to just switch over to the browser, our strategic monthly dashboard, and I'm going to walk you through it. So I'm going to ask, just because I just made a little shift there, I'm going to ask Terry to make sure that it shows up for the audience, because she's in the audience. So
yes, it looks great. We're on the browser screen now.
Okay, I'm not going to go through every metric. I'm going to highlight the ones that are really that are the easiest to discuss on a webinar, and the ones that provide the great strategic insight. So first off, wouldn't it be great, and now we can know, and it's surprising as heck, 150 clubs is in the industry, but 150 clubs is getting close to the industry. We've also made great efforts in the first 150 clubs that participate. We've made great efforts to make sure it tends to be geographically dispersed, that it tends to be dispersed amongst the different types of clubs in the industry. So we have yacht clubs, we have residential community clubs, we have city clubs, we have standalone clubs with golf. We wanted to make sure it includes large clubs that are succeeding wildly and small clubs that are struggling. We have both of those types. We've got a pretty good cross-section of the industry in our first 150 clubs. And we've already learned stuff that I think is incredible. And I can't believe it's coming out the way it is. And, you know, it may change over time. But if you asked me 6 months or a year ago before we had this data, if you asked any industry pundit what % of the clubs in the industry have a waiting list, the answer would typically be about 5 or 6 or 7. I'm not going to say when we get 1,000 clubs participating, it's going to end up at 25, but it's going to be higher than 5 or 6 or 7. But of the 150 plus clubs we have participating, 25% have a wait list, which I found was amazing. Of course, on the flip side of the coin, 25% also have a sell list, which is very interesting. And that's a lot higher than we would have ever guessed. So there's an example of market-based metrics that are critical for clubs and boards to understand that now are available to participants in real time. You can see this data every single month. How about this? The year-over-year change. So right now, we are a Florida club. There's 35 clubs in Florida participating. I said 30 to 40. And right here, this shows for June of 2019 versus June of 2018 for those clubs in Florida that are participating, the year-over-year change in member count is down 0.7%. Basically, that's flat, okay? We can also show that in Florida, on the clubs that are participating, the 35 clubs, there's 2,352 people waiting to get out. We can also show that there's 329 waiting to get in amongst all of those clubs. We can show that in June of 2019, 165 people entered those clubs that are participating in Florida, and 100 exited those clubs that are participating in Florida. Pretty interesting data, really critical market data. We can also, by the way, show what's going on in the industry. So this shows all 150 clubs. It shows the year-over-year change across the country in membership count, and the median is 0.6%. So the median, again, across the industry is pretty much flat. It's grown very, very slightly. Now, if we wanted to, we can change what the industry view is. If I'm in a yacht club, maybe I don't want to look at every club in the industry. Maybe I want to say that my industry is yacht clubs only. So all I do is I click yacht clubs. It's going to, theoretically, it's going to update the data. I think there's a little issue there. Figures. Here I am. I'm on a non-typical Wi-Fi link, so I'm going to have to skip that for the moment. But we can look at what the industry data is by industry subset. So we can look at it as all clubs, clubs with golf, clubs without golf, that will be city clubs, yacht clubs, residential community clubs. So obviously there's a lot of those in Florida. If we want to look at just the subset of the industry that's residential community clubs, standalone clubs with golf, so that's clubs that have golf but they aren't in a residential community. Yacht clubs are city and athletic clubs. So we can actually define what our industry subset is with the click of a mouse. Let's take a look at the cost of belonging and see. This is interesting. And see what is going on. So in the peer group in Florida, if you take all clubs, all of the 35 clubs that belong or that are participating, the average cost of belonging is $13,250. And we can show precisely what portion of that is operating dues, what portion of that is capital fees, that means capital dues plus capital assessments, and what portion of that is all other mandatory fees. We haven't put it into the dashboard, we're about to. We can also break the mandatory fees down into the details like minimum spend in F&V versus locker fees versus cart trail fees versus any other mandatory fees, level service fees, etc. So we can see exactly what the cost of belonging is, and we can see how it changes every single month in the industry. In June of 2019 versus June of 2018, the median change in the total cost of belonging in the 35 clubs participating in Florida is an increase of 3%, as you can see here. We can also look at the high-level financial metrics, and this is really interesting. The year-over-year change in dues revenue in the clubs participating in Florida is an increase. That's June of 19 versus June of 2018. It's a year-over-year increase of 2.6%. But look at what's going on with the non-dues revenue. In June of 19 versus June of 20, the median change in the Florida market was a decrease in non-dues revenue, which is the preponderance. 2/3 of non-dues revenue in clubs is food and beverage revenue. It's down 5.8%. So if I was in a board meeting and we were looking at that, and our club was down 10%, I could say, hey, the market itself is down 6%. That gives us great insight. If I don't have that market data, we're probably going to be spinning and chasing our tail to figure out what's going on in our club because we'll think that something's wrong. I would suggest, and I think the data would bear it out, I'm not sure what exactly it is, whether it was weather or not, but there was a systemic downturn in non-dues revenue in Florida. I was on the west coast of Florida Monday with a group of 10 clubs in Naples, in that we were looking at just the Naples clubs, not all 35 in Florida, and they had the same exact trend. So I think the weather in June probably had an effect ultimately on the non-dues revenue in clubs in Florida, and that's the whole point of the strategic monthly dashboard, is to be able to answer those questions. We can also look at what's changing on the balance sheet in terms of capital income, initiation fee income, and the initiation fees themselves. So we actually have insight with the dashboard into every single one of these metrics. I just touched upon a few just to show you how it works. This is a free service that the Florida chapter has 35 clubs participating in. I would love to get at least half the clubs on this webinar, if not all, to participate when we gather the data next month, because this will give you insight into what's going on in the Florida club market, and it doesn't exist otherwise. So to wrap up, let's use data to change the dialogue in the industry in the boardroom. Let's use data to get the board to look at the strategic picture and look at the market and to think and act strategically rather than trying to micromanage the operation. Let's use data. I know we have managers and staff on this call. Let's use data to allow us as the leaders on the staff in the club to become the experts for our boards. Let's use data so that we are market experts, that we understand our market and we understand it precisely. We're literally talking about, maybe you study it for 20 minutes a month and it takes 20 minutes a month to give us the data. You will precisely understand your market, and you will therefore be the knowledge expert in the club, not the president, not the treasurer, not the finance chair, the GM, the controller, the food and beverage manager. We can know what the heck is going on. It's simple. This is the way we change the dialogue. We change the dialogue with data. We can get the board to understand the market. We can be the leaders of that effort. And this vehicle is the way that we can do that. So if you want to buttress the market insight the Florida clubs have, please participate. It's very simple. It's 20 minutes of work a month, and we'll do whatever we can to help you use this data and show you how to use it. You can set up your own peer group. You could have one in Jacksonville. You could have one in Vero Beach. You could have one in Sarasota, Bradenton, etc. You just need at least 7 clubs in your peer group, including your own club. And if you're not in a peer group, you can still be in the Florida chapter's peer group or the Florida geographic region, okay? So if you wish to participate, send an email. I thought I had it on the slide, I apologize, but send an email to Chris Davis, which is cdavis, C-D-A-V-I-S, @clubbenchmarking.com. Just shoot him an email while we're on the line here and say, can I please participate in your free strategic monthly dashboard so that I can gain the market insight that'll help us lead our board in the right strategic direction. And that is almost straight up to 11 when we're going to end the webinar, but we got a couple of minutes. If there's any questions, I'd love to take them. And I thank everyone for participating today.
I only have one comment, which was an observation that there's been a big conversion in South Florida to casual style dining, which has a lower ticket average.
That's absolutely true. And what we tend to see, and we've got many of the clubs, if not all, of the clubs that have done these casual dining investments send us their annual data. And for the most part, and maybe it's a little bit to the point the person made, the revenue increases, and there are, without question, revenue increases that result from that investment, they more often than not are accompanied by increasing subsidies in F&B, not decreasing subsidies in F&B. So if you lose money in a la carte dining, you know, the old joke was, we'll make it up in volume. If you're losing money and every time someone comes in to have a la carte dining, you're not going to lose less when you have more revenue. You're going to lose more. And the data would bear that out. Clubs lose more. But they also have happier members, and they have a greater value proposition, which has clearly also enticed more interest in the clubs. So if not anything else, I think we'll end it here. Thank you very much for your participation today. And if you have any questions, Chris Davis, C. Davis @clubbenchmarking.com. We thank you very much.